Hi, and welcome back to Black Inventors and Innovators, New Perspectives, our week-long webinar series. For those of you who were here yesterday, we welcome you back. For those just joining us today, welcome. And I think you're in for a very special, really interesting and exciting discussion. I'm Arthur Demrich, Director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, which is a team that's housed within the National Museum of American History, which is one of Smithsonian's museums. And I want to start by welcoming our speakers, moderators, and you, the people who are participating and attending this. It's really a great opportunity for us, despite the horrible circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic. It's a great opportunity for us to open up a program that would otherwise typically be holding in the museum that might not be open and accessible to as many participants. If you have not participated in a Zoom webinar previously, just a couple features I want to point out. Along the bottom of your screen, if you're on a laptop, and somewhere if you tap your cell phone, you'll see a Q&A feature. If you tap that, you can enter a question, which we will get to the moderator to bring to the speakers. The other way you can communicate with other people attending and with the tech crew that works behind the scenes is if you tap on the chat feature. Again, we invite the questions from the audience throughout the program, and today we'll be running as a panel discussion. We are recording this session, and the recording will then be posted online in about 2 weeks once we've lined up the captioning and done post-production. So we'll share that information with you by email and encourage you to share it more widely. I'm part of the Lemelson Center, which is really a group that has this vision of a world that is more inventive, where everyone participates in invention and innovation. And we do our work through exhibits in the museum, through Spark Lab as a hands-on invention space, and more recently now Spark Lab online through Instructables and Tinkercad, which are free platforms accessible to kids and families. We also base that work on research we do, historical research. And this program is a piece of that, of understanding who the key Black inventors have been historically, and also the tensions and why we don't see more Black inventors and innovators as part of our innovation-based economy in the US, and what policy changes need to be made for the future. So we invite you to really join us in exploring this critical and incredibly vital topic. The center has done work on this previously, including back to nearly its origins in 1996, when it hosted a workshop on the technology and the African American experience that resulted in several publications. All of this, I should add, comes out of an initial vision that the philanthropist and benefactor Jerome Lemelson and family gave to the Smithsonian in creating the Lemelson Center, of really seeing invention as a path to success for individuals, as a path to growth and prosperity for communities, and as key to national economic growth. And that vision is something we really like to enact and push on getting young people to see themselves as inventive, and people of all backgrounds and all abilities to say invention is a pathway open to me. So today's session about pathways is thus very timely. And I'm very pleased to then introduce today's moderator, Yolanda Comedy. She's an independent consulting working on STEM policy issues, including the workforce, cybersecurity, and business strategy. Previously, she was director of the American Association for Advancement of Science Center for Advancing Science and Engineering Capacity, where she directed several programs, including the AAAS Lemelson Invention Ambassadors Program, the Mason Award, and Mentor Awards. Dr. Comedy also worked previously for the White House as Senior Policy Analyst for PCAST, the President's Committee on Advisors on Science and Technology, and the President's Information Technology Advisory Committee. Both of those are kind of renowned in science policy circles. And before that, she was at IBM, working on issues including K-12 education reform, high performance computing, and US competitiveness. Dr. Comedy holds a PhD in political science from Indiana University. Welcome, and you're in good hands with Dr. Comedy.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for that nice introduction. I wanted to start by saying thank you to the Smithsonian Lemelson Center for sponsoring this program and allowing this discussion to happen for us today. I also wanted to thank the Lemelson Foundation for supporting this week-long series entitled Black Inventors Innovators, New Perspectives. We really look forward to our session today, which is entitled Pipelines and Pathways, Invention Education, Training, and Mentoring. So we have two major themes that we're going to talk about today, and that's going to be underrepresentation of Blacks in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, also called STEM, and also increasing diversity in STEM. We're going to do a discussion format today. So I'm going to start out by asking questions, and I just encourage the audience to put in your questions anytime that you want, so that we can also pick those questions up as we discuss. Our two discussants today, the first one is James Holly Jr., who's Assistant Professor of Urban Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Education at Wayne State University. Dr. Holly Jr. pursued a doctoral degree at Purdue University to dedicate his career to youth development. He studies how to use research and scholarship for the benefit of educators in urban settings. His dissertation focused on studying and implementing socio-political teaching when instructing Black boys in engineering. Our second discussant is Amy E. Slayton. She is a historian of American science and technology and professor of history at Drexel University. She critiques such modern projects as meritocracy and diversity through the study of material standards, building codes, measurement instruments, textbooks, and many other protocols and apparatus that direct routine to technical practice. More recently, she is working to dissect the concept of STEM diversity. So I'm going to start with my first question, which basically, since the Lemelson Center, the Smithsonian Lemelson Center has done such an incredible job of getting people excited about invention, getting people to understand how important invention is, and even giving ideas about how you can become an inventor. I thought I would ask the question, in your perspective, what is invention and innovation, and what is its role in changing the complexion of STEM and helping to make the US more equitable?
Amy, you want to hop in?
After you.
Well, thanks everyone who is here. Appreciate your attention and participation today. Very honored to be here amongst such legends. So I'm glad to be here. For me, I would say my understanding of invention is more to kind of simplify around creation. So creating something new, novel, whereas I think of innovation as more so kind of modifying, not to say it can't be invention, but it's more so modifying or doing something in a different way or a new way, but not necessarily creating or generating that whatever it is. And so the way I see it as being useful in STEM is, I think the problem itself needs to be racism, right? Like the in innovating, finding new way, like engineers tend to think of themselves as problem solvers. In fact, a lot of disciplines tend to think of themselves as problem solvers, but usually it's around a technological problem. And so I think that the problem then needs to become a human issue around racial equity and very, in areas of difference. And so innovating, thinking like, how do we still, utilize technology or social interactions in a way that's equitable? Like that needs to become the problem. I think that's how you change the complexion of STEM more broadly, is not using or looking at this human issue as tangential to the technologies and kind of like, if I do this technological advancement, it's going to help all people, but really being more honest and direct about the disenfranchisement of our history, particularly in America, and making that the central issue in innovating and inventing, creating new ways of thinking about STEM, creating, science and mathematics, creating new ways and modifying old ways so that issue is addressed.
Yeah, should I jump in? So yeah, thanks to all. I'm so excited to be here, and thanks to Yolanda for guiding us through this conversation, and James, thanks for that fabulous start. And I think I feel the same way, that as a historian, I think I see invention and innovation as as things that change their meaning over time. And I think this is something that Dr. Fouché and Dr. Cook started us thinking about yesterday, right? Which is their labels, innovation and invention, they're labels for particular activities and particular ideas and particular people in different times and places. And I think that there's a pattern where, you know, certain kinds of attributions of who is an inventor, who can be an innovator, are really significant, because with those labels, as we've already, you know, brought up in the yesterday, comes opportunity, comes credibility, comes profit. And so I guess my way of seeing those words is as expressions of what I agree is a profoundly racist set of social structures. I think US industrial capitalism is the landscape in which we look for technological change, we look for individual opportunity. And I have to say, I also see it as right now just deeply committed to perpetuating human differences, right? Deeply committed to racism and sexism. And I guess that's kind of what I'd start with, which is I would like to see invention and innovation, just like we might in a different era have looked at Yankee ingenuity, right? As something, these are terms rooted in a certain time and place. And right now, I think they are ways that they are terms that bring security, bring opportunity to primarily to the people who've always garnered, you know, good things from being inventors and innovators, mostly men, mostly white, you know, straight, cis, I'd say often still in this country, Protestant, able. I often use the term who is invention or who is engineering, rather than imagining that there's sort of a body of practice, a body of skills that just is out there waiting for some abstract participants. I don't think so. I think what we call rigor, what we call creativity, what we call novelty is something that comes out of an essentially stratified and not terribly equitable society. So like James, I'd like to keep them together. I also want to throw in some questions about whether those are words that can ever do what we want them to do, because I'm so intrigued by new studies of maintenance, by new studies of maker cultures that really help us draw the lines around what counts as a contribution to the economy. And I'd also say, given the opportunity, I'll throw in a pitch for some decolonializing framework that also says, look, the thing that counts as an economic contribution in the United States still remains pretty narrow definitionally and kind of retro. So those are my big historical kind of pitches to answer.
I wanted to kind of jump in and respond to that too. Like, first going back, like what I like about Amy's focus on delineating STEM diversity is, even as she spoke about, like she kept using the term difference. And I think fundamentally that's what diversity is difference in whatever types of forms or ways that shows up. And unfortunately, within the STEM context, it has different connotations. We're not using the same language, even as we're talking about what we're trying to address, right? So I think that's the thing. But also, you talk about decolonizing, or you talk about maker spaces. A lot of that is culture shifting, right? I'm not as familiar, but my dissertation advisor did a lot of work with maker spaces, and the thing that people saw was there was this power differential or shift, right? It changes the culture of who's in charge, and so it allows more flexibility and not only what you can do and what counts, but also who can engage the space. But again, it has its own limitations in terms of access and so on like that.
Right.
So I think that when we're talking about these issues, we have to think about like, why are we trying to do difference, or what type of aims do we have? What are the impetus for the difference we're seeking? Because that then informs how we go about following that process.
Okay, so if I could kind of put both of you on the spot a little bit, can you name some things that you think are invention that aren't normally considered invention in society? So in a lot of circles that I've been in, you need a patent to be an inventor. That's when people really start looking at you as an inventor. Sometimes you can, you can be inventive without a patent, but it has to be pretty economically viable for people to start really getting excited about it. So can you name some things that are inventive that we don't normally consider inventive in our culture?
Shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think I would pivot the question a little bit, and instead of trying to reformulate the term invention so it includes more than patents or it includes more than profitability or more than things that can be scaled up, I think I would back up a little further and say, what kind of knowledge, practice, and creativity do we want to have value to our economy? And I think that I would put aside the notion of the stuff that, yeah, I'm not saying dump capitalism and go for some other system. I'm just saying that we're awfully familiar with a very narrow pathway towards economic contribution and economic health that kind of serves, for example, a system that relies on very stratified labor that doesn't really particularly redistribute wealth. We rely on an economic system that has huge environmental costs. So maybe rather than saying what should we start granting credibility as invention, I might say what would we want to reimagine as a contribution to the collective good besides what we have customarily called technological novelty or advancement or even modernization. So I'd go wide on the question, I think.
I'd say that, so with the students I work with and the young folks and also students in college and younger pre-college students or people, I think I have a lot of conversations around culture, specifically Black culture, Black history, and things like that. So when I hear what type of inventions that aren't traditionally seen as inventions, I think of the Underground Railroad. I think of soul food. I think of the Black church. Like these are institutions and ways of being and styles that were formed out of exclusion. Folks were, so I think in that way kind of aligns with Amy's answer, where people were excluded in a certain way. So you had to create an alternative way, alternative ontology, and even epistemology, like different ways of thinking and using what you have, not only in limited resources, but also very oppressive circumstances and structures. And so, like, to me, that's what caused me to think about what are the ways that Black folks have had to navigate survival and taking traditional things, so like the pig and different animals and different type of scraps, and innovating to providing food. Now we can talk about the side effects and all those, the health benefits or lack thereof and all of that, but it was for survival, right? And it was very limited. And in similar ways of speaking, many folks call it Black English or African American vernacular English. Like, to me, that's an innovation. We had to communicate in a different way. And so that then formed new ways of developing knowledge and understanding that when we come to a classroom, we're not all speaking the same language literally, because even if we're saying, speaking standard English, what I understand by a particular word or a certain concept in a particular discipline is wholly different.
Okay,
And
great.
can I just emphasize one thing about that, which I think is amazing, which is what James just described as examples of creativity and I'd say ingenuity and responsiveness. Yeah, there's a lot of novelty in those activities, but there's a lot of heritage, there's a lot of tradition, there's a lot of culture. So I think it makes us realize that ingenuity does not have to be pegged to only to novelty and change and replacement. It can be celebratory and enriching of traditions and collectivities and heritage too, which is not something we normally associate with patents or things. It's in there, but we tend to say, no, the patent is the wholly new and the wholly refreshed, the revolutionary, but we also want that heritage, we want traditions that are of value to a culture.
And I know you want to ask a question, but I want to ask another comment. Like, I somewhat struggle, or I should say feel intimidated by the idea of patents, because I don't think of myself as a creator, more so in the innovation, like how can we use what we already have? And also I think how can we build on a lot of unused information, right? When I look historically about how Black folks have moved in this country, there's a lot of stuff that has not really been built upon. This morning, I was listening to a conversation around political activism and organizing. And so there are plans where people feel like they're creating new plans to do certain things. And I think in a similar way, when it comes to engineering or Black scientists, they created a blueprint and it's just like, all right, that was nice for that moment. We're going to do something different rather than building upon like foundational plans and saying, how can we enhance that and enrich that for our current context? Is this desire for newness, I think, cause us to not fully get the most out of what we already have. And it shifts like there's a pressure that I have to do something new, even if that newness isn't really of substance, rather than digging into what's already there and say, how can we just be okay? I think that folks in indigenous culture is more like, let's just make use of what we have. We don't have to create this new thing because it creates a more predatory type of dynamic, right? Where I have to exclude yours or downplay what you have so that mine can be seen as more valuable.
Triumph. Yeah.
You're right. And so this patent culture, if you will, I think kind of like, oh, I got a patent. Yeah, but what does that contribute to society? What does that contribute to humanity? Or is it just like self, development? And those aren't all the same. I mean, there's nuance there,
right.
But that's kind of my positionality around it.
So if you look at both the traditional meaning of invention and also the different kinds of invention that you've been talking about by answering the last question, can you talk a little bit about how you think invention and innovation can increase diversity in STEM, or if that's even possible? And if there's anything about innovation and invention that will help us change inequities in the United States?
You can take that, Amy.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I was like, yeah, that's a huge question. And again, I would really hesitate. Again, I'd like to go a bit wide on that question, because I think that we need that reformulation that James has outlined of imagining that the novel, the modernized, the profitable are themselves categories that can really just reinstate existing privileges and power systems. And one of the things we've kind of thought about a bit, as we've discussed what we would cover today, is this idea of competitiveness in the United States. And I think that James hints at this when he talks about possibly the focus on patents and novelty embeds this competitive ideology, which means that yes, an individual person may achieve occupational status, may earn money, may bring good things to their employer. This is the history of IP in many ways, but I just worry that the way that we handle these terms right now are still going to reproduce, much more stubborn structural inequities. So I guess for me to think, what can invention and innovation do? I think projects like, the Spark Lab that excite kids, these are great. I also think projects like some of the race positive science and mathematics curricula that we're seeing it developed at Michigan State, some of the indigenous knowledge systems that do not easily fit under the rubrics of invention and innovation, do not easily fit in at first glance to economic improvement in ways we're used to looking at that. I think bringing those forward is immensely important, and that young children are able to see that even the notion of an individual creative mind is not something they necessarily have to hold on to, that they can work as a community, they can work as a group. And I don't know, I would like to see all the experiences of problem shaping and problem solving that are not so tied to usable outcomes in the familiar ways. I know that's a bit loose, but I guess I'm just looking to decenter those terms right now as we know them.
Okay, we had several questions from the audience that wants you to relate STEM diversity, invention, innovation to some of the real world problems that we face. So one of the questions was, very directly saying, and how does this relate to jobs? Right? How do you turn the ideas about diverse STEM workforce and invention into things, real jobs for real people in the 21st century?
James, you want to?
Yeah, so I got lost a little bit looking at comments and questions myself. And one that I saw is, and I'm gonna relate this to the question, but someone coming to that racism is a strong word, right? And offer some suggestions. And I think like until we get to the point where that's not a strong word, but that's
Yeah.
an accurate descriptor of our history, like then how we're talking about jobs and innovation becomes very difficult.
Yes.
Because when you're innovating and being creative to exist, then you're not thinking in the same way that someone who's being innovative to live, increase
Yeah.
their quality of life or to advance or do something new.
Right.
Dr. Fouché mentioned, he showed some slides of different folks, and I can't recall the artist that he quoted, but it was talking about man on the moon, and it was talking about like, white man on the moon, but I'm trying to pay my bills. It's a man on the moon, but I'm trying to basically like everyday struggles that this person is trying to navigate.
Right, that's
While
Gil
folks,
Scott Heron.
Yeah.
can you say that again?
Gil Scott Heron.
Right. So, and do you remember the name of the record or the song?
Whitey's on the Moon.
Whitey's on the moon, right? And so we're literally operating in these different planes. So
Yeah.
innovation, which I think relates to the jobs question, that's a more practical thing. But even when I go myself having a degree in engineering, for many the goal is to go work for Ford, right? I'm being in being from Detroit, even though the big three aren't in Detroit proper, General Motors, Ford, or Chrysler. But if they're just doing things that again are moon based or like it like doesn't change my reality, then all of a sudden that job loses its value to me. It's insufficient and inadequate. Or I'm working but I can't sustain for my family, right? I'm working but I'm essentially an indentured servant to those companies because I don't build other skills or I don't make enough to do what I need to do to survive in this context. And so that's why I go back to my original point that innovation has to be built around the race issue or the issues of difference, not just racism or sexism, but those issues of difference. How do we design new systems and new ways of new economies and new, social relations and political systems that center equitable experiences? And so I think when you're talking about jobs, like too often the goal for my community is to go get a job. As we speak about pathways, and I'm going kind of long, but we're talking about pathways. For me, the reason I went into engineering and why it was hard for me to think of anything else, because when I told people that I was studying engineering, they were like, well, you're smart and you're going to get, and you're going to make a lot of money. And so coming from a city like Detroit that is has high rates of poverty, it's hard to kind of convince somebody else that I want something more than just making money or the label of being smart. And so I think we have to be innovative in the ways that we appreciate people's values and their dignity and humanity. For some people like to create just to create, that's what gets them going. And then some folks don't. But right now, people are creating and innovating in small ways just to survive. And so I think like the jobs question is we think politically, there are a lot of folks this political election that offer, plans for a job guarantee. I think of Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity. They're folks who are advocating for reparations. All right. So how do you have these interdisciplinary solutions that are focused on human equity? I think is how we get to that type of practical everyday issue.
Yeah. Can I amplify? Yeah. And I just want to signal very clearly that this idea that we should be polite or kind or delicate with our use of the term racism or sexism or ableism or, or homophobia or xenophobia, I think we cannot afford to be polite. And I think that we have seen that there's a tremendous tolerance in this country, I think probably among non-minoritized voters, for deep, deep, deep inequities in economic opportunity, education and health and housing. And I think that to talk about inclusion and diversity and opportunity without making those that comfort level that so many people have with racism without making that, put that in the front of our stories, we're really doing a disservice to all our efforts. And in a sense, I think projects like the Green New Deal and, COVID core, and this idea that the crises that we're facing right now could be the place where education and work, really grow with federal support are hugely important. But I also wondered this summer, so my university is in the middle of Philadelphia, and there were many demonstrations and uprising. And the response of our university was to express, condolences for George Floyd's family, to express solidarity with our Black neighbors in Philadelphia, but then to kind of look for DEI cultural change, rather than, why would university presidents not all come together, go to Washington? We already have lobbyists there. Why not go and say it's time for Congress to turn funds back to, the universities and support STEM training that addresses our immediate crises? Why not have the universities step up into some of the kinds of changes they say they want to be engaged with, right? And that James just described, a cultural political reformation. I think if we don't, I know those sound giant and like, how can we ever do anything about them? But I think if we don't honestly see them happening, all the goodwill in the world just kind of, we're kind of buzzing around very small parts of the picture. James, I hope that's compatible with what you said. I didn't mean to, I was trying to kind of make a big landscape around it.
I think, and one of the reasons why I think this week is so excellent is because it's censoring the Black perspective or experience, right? And so again, I want to point back to one of the things that Dr. Fouché shared, and that's not to say that Dr. Cook didn't have anything good. It's just some things kind of resonated different with me, but he shared a quote from Amiri Baraka's book, Raise, Race, Raise, and Raise. And it says, how do you communicate with the great masses of Black people? How do you use the earth to feed the masses of people? How do you cure illness? How do you prevent illness? What are the Black purposes of space travel? And so, like, when we frame things from a Black lens, we can see that a lot of Black folks have certain experiences that inform what they want to do. But when we go back to jobs, we have discriminatory and exclusionary practices. They don't get those opportunities. And so when we're talking about innovation, I think we have to get at those exclusionary practices of difference that prevent broader innovation. Dr. Ebony McGee has a book, Black, Brown, Bruised, How Racialized STEM Education Stifles Innovation. And she looks at like, we are further behind than where we should be in terms of innovation due to issues like racism. And I think going back to Amiri Baraka's quote is like, I think about in the medical field, right? A lot of innovations and inventions come out regularly, but yet still, Black women at I think a 4 times higher rate of infant mortality and maternal mortality than white women. And so what innovation we're gonna have to address that? And so like some things can't be solved by products. We need ways of being and ways of thinking that we're currently suppressing. And I think that, like, again, centering Black experience, a lot of Black inventors and Black thinkers, they aimed with that in mind, or they created with that in mind. And so we've lost that type of richness where a few people are able to squeeze out and we celebrate them as these shiny unicorns, when really there's so much more ingenuity and creativity within the Black community that's very severely inhibited, that could address a lot of issues in the Black community because we know it best.
So Amy started down the path of talking about 2020 and all of the things that have happened, COVID, police shootings, demonstrations. How does this 2020 climate make you feel about the possibility of making some of the changes in the United States that you've been talking about, both in terms of treating invention differently and in terms of having more diversity in STEM?
All right. I really don't know how I feel. It vacillates. Sometimes it's optimism, sometimes it's more cynicism and pessimism, given just the history of how long, the history of America. And I think in some ways I am encouraged because there's some new things that are happening, new conversations being had, more frequent conversation, new new discourses that are taking place, new terms being used. But also we've seen that happen and then it kind of phases out. And so I think the jury is still out. We still have to wait and see what these things manifest into. However, I also feel as if like it's unfortunate when these things are amplified by Black death, right? I think when you look at 2020, Black folks aren't the only ones dying. That's not the case I'm making, but
Mhm,
more so when we look at the novel coronavirus pandemic, uh,
mhm.
you know, when it came out statistics around who was dying, it was heavily disproportionate towards Black people. And it was connected to other systemic injustices. And then when we look at the inundation of Black murder and Black death and anti-Black violence, we're watching videos be circulated and recirculated, and media around watching Black people literally be killed in various ways. And so I think when we think about George Floyd's murder, it took watching a man be killed over the process of almost 9 minutes for folks to say, oh man, like I guess racism is a problem. And so I mean, if it takes that much to get just a little bit, it's taxing, it's fatiguing. So I
Yeah.
think that there are some new ways that people are giving attention. I've had folks reach out to me. I've had opportunities like this, and I am appreciative of that. Trust me, please, like sincerely, I am. But I'm also very skeptical in terms of like if we don't have the tools necessary to build off of foundational history things, like how where are we going? Like what are we moving to? Even if folks want to do things, they're not willing to dig in deeper and really reflect on why didn't we see this before? Why didn't we have these understandings before? Um, so I think there is this kind of I vacillate between there where opportunities are, but where it's kind of representative like that we haven't really moved that far.
Yeah. I think I have that same mixed set of feelings. I mean, I would just add, the only thing I would add to what James said is that I think that we among the tools that we if we're serious and sincere, and by the word we, I'm going to say white people, right? And I'll speak from the side of like, oh, okay, we're being identified with a long history of violence and oppression. um, there's also a question not just of tools but about resources, right? And what has to move in terms of resources for new orientations and ideologies to be sustainable, to result in hires and educational opportunities and health and housing reforms. Resources need to move, money needs to move, experts need to move from their current commitments to other places. And I would just say that I think that the activists who have been most perhaps visible in the public sector during 2020 around um, um, articulating anti-racist approaches know that long before George Floyd was killed, Chicago was operating, a secret site for the processing of Black criminals. Long before that, there would have been Cahill, Jamal Muhammad has written a brilliant book about how statisticians helped establish the notion of Black criminality as an inborn trait in 1900, right? There, folks who are pointing to things happening right now, know full, they have been showing us for a long time. So I totally agree with James that for the new awareness that majority Americans, allies, let's say, have developed, it's going to have to go way beyond just a kind of concerned awareness and into action and change and deference and deferral to Black observers, Black experts, commentators, people of color, disabled people, just all sorts of folks who know a great deal more about how this has come to be than those of
So
us.
if we can move this conversation a little bit to over the last, God, I don't know how many years, at least 40 probably, organizations like AAAS and American Chemical Society, et cetera, have programs where they're really trying to, diversify their membership and help create research and ideas about diversifying education and making STEM available to more people. So what's happened over 40 years where things have not changed the way we had hoped they would change when these efforts started? Are there ideas that you have about new things that need to be done, or ideas about what failed in the past?
Can I start that, James? Really? So the last book that I wrote was a history of diversification, very broadly used from sort of the era of segregation in the United States up through the 90s, the affirmative action era. And one thing that was not an answer to the lack of change, you can't explain the lack of change by insincere actors, educators and policymakers and mentors who don't take their aim seriously. That's not the explanation. It's true that the statistics point to really stubborn patterns of underrepresentation of minoritized people, more so in some fields than other, more so for some groups than others. But I think, Yolanda, your points that it hasn't changed nearly as much as any of us would have wanted to. It's not because someone wasn't doing what they set out to do with sincerity and with energy. I think it's because these large structures haven't changed, and they're not just structures inside of higher ed. We've been talking about it. We wouldn't have the COVID crisis. We wouldn't have housing crises and other crises, and such constricted Black earning power if it was just higher ed. It's pervasive, but I think that my answer to the question as a historian would be because things will not change until we look at the problem differently. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to James' original point, which is, I think maybe to say that which counts as change needs to be something other than what we've looked for. If I'm paraphrasing correctly, I'll bounce it over to you, James.
And that, again, coming from an engineering background, that issue where you landed around problem framing is very critical. So in the engineering design process, if you will, like it starts with problem definition. Yep. What is the problem? So is the problem that we don't have enough different people? Mm-hmm. And so, or is it a problem that we don't have enough different types of thought? How are people defining the problem? And what I've seen is, particularly in the pre-college or, I just say pre-college, because some say preschool to 12th grade or whatever. In the pre-college space, there's more aspiration towards numerical representation. Mm-hmm. So how many disabled people do we have, or how many Black folks, or how many low-income people do we have, rather than inclusion of, or seeking towards like freedom of thought, emancipatory thought, mm-hmm. alternative ways of doing things. So a diversity in like how people, again, epistemology, ontology, mm-hmm. and axiology. So the values that people have. Someone values equity, like interacting in ethics and morality. Mm-hmm. More importantly, how do we allow them to exist in the space and feel fully welcome? In the same way that someone who values profit primarily, right? Like if that's what they want, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But that, or examining how do those run against each other, right? In what mm-hmm. ways does the profit-focused initiative disrupt or cause an issue with someone who just wants to exist and take care of their community? And so I think there's another, and I'm trying to share resources, another book, Diversifying STEM, Multidisciplinary Perspectives on Race and Gender. I think that really gets at what those problems are. Because a lot of folks that want to like bring folks in, we want new people, we want different perspectives, but what is not said, or what is much less implicit or implied, I should say, is those people have to assimilate to the dominant ways and the dominant culture. So they can come if they're willing to leave certain aspects of their identity at the door. And if they want to, this is the book, I see someone asking for it again. If they want to leave certain values at the door or not include certain aspects of their personality and humanity, then they're welcome, they're allowed to come in. But if you don't do that, if you want to cause conflict and show how you're different, not purposefully, but just that's the way who you are. And it disrupts is different from the dominant culture. And you're not allowed to be there. And so those type of things really prevent the type of significant adjustments and changes that are needed. And I think that I had another thought, but I kind of lost it. So
Can I just,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to tag one idea, attach an earlier idea to what James just said, which is that we kind of have used the word meritocracy before. And I think one of the broadest impediments to change, I think, has been our insistence, and I think this is very much baked into STEM, but the idea that merit is something that we can identify, we can measure, and it's in the individual. It inheres in the individual. It's like IQ. Maybe it's combined IQ and grit, maybe it's creativity and, and energy, but it still inheres in the individual. And I think as long as we see it that way and resist seeing merit as a set of social relations, as something that comes into being, by the combination of the student and the testing regime, it comes into being when the employer meets when the employee meets the employer who looks at their CV. I think as long as we resist the idea of merit as something that has a social basis, we will never open to the kinds of intellectual and axiomatic diversity that James mentions. I see merit as a profoundly problematic social instrument as it works in the United States right now. And someone always says to me, but the bridges are going to fall down if you ditch merit and the fiber optic cables won't work. And I'm like, right, I rest my case. That's how merit works in this country, to make us think that there's a realm that doesn't have sociability or politics. Not true. So.
Okay, so you guys have outlined problems that we face in the United States. And we've talked a lot about institutions that are responsible for some of those problems. If we change gears a little bit, how do we think about what would excite and inspire the current generation of students to start innovating and making changes to solve the problems that exist in the society? What are the methods and what's the thought process that we need to make sure that even if systems aren't solving our problems, that the students are learning how to take on some of those things themselves?
So I'll hop in again, delving into the K-12 arena.
Okay.
I work with pre-service teachers. I'm in the College of Education, teacher education division. And so often what I have to try to help teachers think through is, or pre-service aspiring teachers is like, or help them understand is like a lot of the policies and standards that teachers are given are very constraining. A lot of times, it's about students regurgitating or adhering to these standardized tests, even amid unstandard educational experiences, or using tests that I won't say we know, because I'm not going to assume everybody has the same information, but many studies have shown are racially biased. And so I think flexing and expanding the ways in which we view the learning and educational process, teaching in a way where it's like, okay, this is what I think is important for you to know, but there are various ways for you to demonstrate that knowledge. That's what I was going to say earlier. Traditionally, the STEM disciplines are seen as objective, right? We're all working, there's only one way of doing it. We're all looking for the same answer. But I think if you look at the world, many people engage mathematics differently, engage science differently. And unfortunately, in our school community and learning environments in general, we don't allow a more flexible way of understanding what knowledge is and how we get there. So I think one way, if we're talking about moving from the problem and expanding that, is expanding the educational policies. I think about No Child Left Behind and the damage that did. It really penalized schools that were low wealth rather than like not performing well. Right. And again, we had a conversation around what the written policy was versus implementation and how much implementation matters. But we also can just, using Amy's expertise in terms of history, we can just look back and see the damage that was done. And so in a very similar way, I think that we need inventive and innovative policies around schooling and
Mhm.
schooling practices that follows learning science. Learning sciences tell us that these are not the best ways, in which, particularly urban schools and high poverty communities, it's not the best way for them to learn and exercise their skill sets. I'll start there. I'll stop at that one. I mean, I have more, but I'll toss it over to Amy.
So yeah, so I agree that it needs to be a policy question, and I wouldn't want to ask teachers or students to solve the problem, right? I wouldn't even want, engineering education researchers or historians to have to solve the problem. I think we have to demand that our universities, again, move resources and move priorities so that you want greater diversity, you want more young people to feel engaged with these possibilities for themselves. Make sure you have fairly paid graduate students who can be TAs in a way that is, to the best of their abilities. Make sure you have tenure track faculty and don't rely on increasingly precarious, personnel who can't teach well, right? That's just decent labor stuff. And then, let's end student debt. I mean, it seems very hypocritical to me to be, a kind of a voice of inclusion that then doesn't also advocate for, economic justice in the access, the world of access to education and things like that. But I think while we have the policy stuff in mind, I think we do need to go inside of STEM. I think we have to go inside of the epistemics, and we have to say, what does rigor look like? If it just looks like something that involves numbers or graphing or that familiar idea of objectivity, we're never going to have liberal thinking in the sense of, the broadest sense of that word, right? Like unpredictable and creative. We need for students to feel totally comfortable coming into an engineering classroom with their own experiences, with their own identity, with their bodies. If they're tired, let's not pretend that that's not happening. If they have a chronic illness, if they're let's not pretend that Black student didn't just come from experiencing a set of microaggressions in the lab. I mean, if we can't bring the social experiences and social dimensions forward in STEM with respect, with appreciation, I don't think we can access any of the kind of rich, truly reformative experiences that we say we want in our students. So I know that's really broad, but I'm trying to say we need the policy change, but we need the epistemic change, and certainly standardized testing. And I'd get rid of GPAs if I could, but just all the things that narrowly measure and sort are part of the problem. So.
And I'll extend that to, I know you had a question you want to hop in, Austin, on that as well. So thinking about like subjectivities or cultural teaching, as you read about my bio, I studied around like social political teaching in terms of engineering. That needs to be embedded, like those type of standards and expectations and accountability measures need to be embedded into the way, the expectation that educators across the pre-college and collegiate space are held accountable or expected to do. Because if you think about inventors and innovators, a lot of times we think about Black inventors and things like that, it's about what they created, not necessarily their process, not necessarily why they did what they did, nor the influence or impact on what they did. And so, but also it's only like, Black History Month, right? And so whether we took the different ethnicities or perspectives, disabled or people with disabilities who have invented and created or inspired inventions, right? We need to create this broadened viewpoint of how our society works, because with the white normativity or white dominant, and everyone else is looking at that as a standard, and as an educator, that's the expectation from what you're framing and teaching other people, then that's limiting in and of itself, right? And as a professor or a teacher, if that's what my evaluation is based upon, like just getting across these traditional ways of doing it, then that's what it's going to be in terms of the general and dominant way of teaching things. And so we have to figure out how, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, if you want to use those terms, Like usually those are like, there's all the professional standards or the main things, and then you have that on the side, right? Like
Yeah,
do all of
exactly.
this and then do this.
Right.
And these
Right.
need to be both, and they need to be present from a hierarchical standpoint, but also embedded within the standards of teaching and so on. And I think that if you're talking about solutions, that's a very practical way to expand the expectations for students and learners and future innovators, right? Like I'm not just going to take the traditional way and try to build on that. I'm going to look at other ways of thinking and knowing, and that's where the diversification comes in and broadens complex and nuanced ways of making more broadly applicable solutions and more broadly applicable creations and products and technologies.
Okay, so if we can talk a little bit about policy. So obviously for the last 40 years or more, people have tried to do a lot of things that you're talking about, I think, or at least started with that intention. And we have several audience questions around how really difficult it is to change systems. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about really how difficult it is to change systems and how we get people thinking along a different line, because we have a long history of thinking the way we're thinking. And it's not an easy process. You know, having worked in the policy world for a long time, it takes a lot to change very little. It's just amazing how, you know, the status quo is comfortable for the people that are it's comfortable for, and then the people that you're trying to change the policies against. So how do we really have some concrete ideas about how we do something different in the next 40 years than we've been successful doing in this last 40 years?
Shall I start? I'll start, and I'll just say
I'm pointing this way on you. You're right.
Yeah.
I don't really know how you're feeling that for
now
other people.
we're both pointing at each other.
Okay.
So for me, again, I am not a researcher in policy. I'm not an education researcher. I am not an educational expert. I'm a historian. So part of my my self-identity is I want to point to understandings over time. I can't say that I have direct operational interventions, maybe on the level of, curricula, or on the level of admissions policies and things like that. But I can say that I look at the culture in the United States and I see a really pronounced sentiment of worry among many different educators and many different policymakers and many different professionals in STEM fields, a pronounced sense of worry about discrimination that is relieved in large part when inclusion occurs, when diversity is achieved, when a certain set of numbers might be reached, or when individual students achieve. And while that is in no way a negative event or a negative feeling about that event, I think it can hide other things that are going on. I think the positive feeling that diversity work and diversity successes can bring, especially to non-minoritized people who are not in a position of precarity and are not living with these challenges, right? I think that feeling that we know what to do, that we can see it, we see it, that feeling that we are part of the solution. I think someone actually put that phrase in the chat, right? I think has to change. I think the feelings that good feelings are enough, that has to change. I think we've got to commit to discomfort. And by we, again, I mean those of us who are not in a position of precarity and not facing discrimination in any significant way. We've got to understand that we don't get to be comfortable right now. We don't get to really, am I against tolerance? Of course not. Am I against, anti-racist efforts? Of course not. But they are not enough. They haven't done what we've done. So I'm going to advocate for discomfort for those of us who see comfort as part of the solution. I just have to say it. I mean, it's not a very direct, practical answer in some ways to what Yolanda just framed, but I think it's vital. And I think it's awfully hard to think with, but we must. So that's my kind of culture and climate intervention. And I hope I can build a strong historical case for that and not make it seem like I'm just poking and prodding. But I've seen the history of white comfort, and I think it preserves a tremendous amount of power and privilege. And we've got to ask questions about it.
Okay,
Yes,
James.
I think it was good is a good model when you start off just acknowledging limitations, right? So in my case, I'm an educator at the collegiate level in STEM education, not necessarily STEM policy or policy expert. I mean, I read about these things, but so I just want to put that disclaimer out there. I'm not an expert in that regard on how to address those. However, what I suggest, I have a few. One thing would be advocating for equity over equality. And what that means is prioritizing various people or offering more for particular people. I'm doing a presentation. Had a conversation. I'll be doing a presentation tomorrow about dignifying the disinherited. And what that's talking about is the particular Black folks who have been eliminated and preventing from bearing the fruit of our labor or our ancestors' labor, and many folks currently who are working hard but don't get those fruits, and other folks are able to exploit the fruits of folks' labor. Thinking about what would it mean to prioritize their needs over my own, politically, economically, academically, and so on. When it comes to housing policies or whatever, what would it look like to say, all right, this is the position I'm in. I'm in a position of privilege. I have a power in this racial caste system that can be leveraged in various ways. I have capital in this particular social arrangement that can be leveraged in certain ways. How can I leverage that on behalf of those who are much less privileged or disadvantaged or oppressed? I think that's very important because currently, I mean, historically, there's been a lot of we know our history. Folks were enslaved on this land space for 246 years. And we're not even as old enough as a country to kind of pass that. And so the consequences of that is still with us. But yet we talk about equality, right? We're giving everybody the same thing. But when you started, so much ahead, however you want to characterize that advantage, giving me the same thing as you is not going to help me get to where I need to be. I need more, right? And so I think we have gone comfortable with folks who, in spite of the disadvantage and oppression, have still managed to find some aspects of success. We're like, well, look, so-and-so could do it. And then earlier I referenced unicorns, and someone asked for explanation. So unicorns is the idea, this special, fantastical, unique animal, right? It has the one horn, right? That is so mythical and magical, and it's so special and unique. And that's how we treat Black people who experience various amounts of success. It's like, well, they can do it, and we act as if everyone should be able to do it, when really there's a number of circumstances and opportunities that coalesce to allow that. And so we really have to focus more on how do we help more people who are lacking more, give folks what they need, as opposed to giving everybody the same thing, which is going to require making some difficult decisions as it relates to policy. As we think about things like affirmative action, as we think about things like reparations, those things are not about, hey, equal opportunity. Opportunity has never been equal. And so I see you throwing your hand up, Amy.
Well, I find that such a rich framing, because I guess I could kind of say what I see a lot of diversity programming to land on is what I think amounts again to racial reconciliation, to everybody feeling better and to tamping down hostility. And there's plenty of hostility around us. We've seen it in terrible forms in the last 4 years, especially. It's always been there, but it's erupted, right? Versus what you're describing, which I think is redistributive and reparative. And I think those are strong juxtapositions. But I actually think those aren't abstract concepts. And I do have one practical thought. I can do something practical. So in my last book, which was kind of got us from the 1930s up through the 1990s, describing the whiteness of engineering, one of the really interesting thing I found was that NASA in the 1990s had this really interesting program to support the development of research in HBCUs. And it was very much around things you might imagine that NASA would support, like materials research and, aeronautics, right? But the nature of the grant program that NASA devised was that while many of their grant programs for historically majority serving institutions, right, that had traditionally had strong engineering and science programs and good labs, those grants traditionally had one time frame. Maybe it was a 5-year, required 5 years, and then you had to have a demonstrable result. The HBCU grants were given a longer time frame. I can't remember the details, but it was longer. It was maybe 7 years, right? And of course, a lot of people responded by saying, oh, that's not fair. You're lowering the standards. I mean, it was the standard arguments that are brought to any affirmative action program, right? You're lowering the standards, right? And NASA said, we're NASA. We can do what we want. Yay, NASA, right? In that moment, right? But what I learned from looking at that is that what counted as good materials research, good materials engineering, was not just what was studied, how it was researched, how it was reproduced, but the pace at which it was done, right? It had to happen in 5 years. That's what showed you it was smart, hardworking people. And NASA said, no, the time that we're saying counts as the pace that counts as rigor is an arbitrary one. It's arbitrary. The materials that come out at the end of 7 years are no less useful, are no less carefully devised, are no less thoroughly tested. That university needed a couple years to get its research program up and running, to make up for equipment deficits from historical underfunding, right? And at the end, it's the same product. And it is, of course it is. Years later, those recipients, those HBCUs are at the absolute head of the field, right? So NASA did this thing where they stood back from what they, had been thinking were standards and rigor and achievement, and it opened up a completely different set of opportunity structures, right? So in some ways, it just seems, that's about as practical as I get, but it just seems like a way to say, look, let us go not just to the places where we are already kind of scratching our heads about the utility of standardized tests and the horrendous implications of No Child Left Behind. Let's just go everywhere we can in STEM and imagine that could be a place where exclusion and discrimination have happened, that it can be really inside our understanding of what valuable work and rigorous work is.
So
go ahead, Jane.
yeah, I still had some other pieces and I'm connect these, but when you talk about history, I think that's very important in general, because even as you say, like when people read certain things, it's just like, oh my goodness, that's unfair. A lot of Americans, we have been given a false history, and so it requires some individual information seeking to learn about how did we get to where we are.
Yeah.
And for me, from my own experience, I was more aware growing up in a predominantly Black city that has a high rate of poverty, that some things were not right. That as folks said they were not totally what it is. But it wasn't until my doctoral program that I began to dig more individually into the experience of Black people in this nation. And that revealed a lot to me around this particularities around what has been done, how it's played out, and how we contribute to the space. So when I speak about what needs to change and whatever, it's not from just, I want a better life. It's more so like, when you think about reparations and you talk about repair, it's about what is old and what has been done that has not been redressed. It's not about wanting, handouts and so on. It's about these are real lives, real histories that have not been conciliated, all the harm and pain. And so we think about addressing policies. We live in, I think many would call it a democratic republic, right? This is not a democracy in terms of our political system, where you have representatives in theory who should represent you. And I think when we think about numbers, there are certain folks who are more represented and more heard than others when it comes to, the racial caste system as well as wealth and capital. So we need those folks to step back and say, okay, if I care about this, what don't I know about how we came to get where we are, right? We're still operating on selecting the president based on the system that was implemented based on chattel slavery, with the electoral college. And so some, it is some things, some of it's just kind of common sense, like that just needs to go. But I think we need folks to kind of learn more and take a serious look at our history to say, like, this is not about what somebody simply wants. This is, if we want those stated values to be true, which I don't believe we do, but if we do, there's going to be some rectifying of past wrongs
Mhm.
that needs to take place before we can really get to where we need to be.
So as our time is getting less and less, I want to kind of combine two questions, although they're really, really different. So one is, I don't know if it's an easy question, but it's a little less theoretical, which is how do we showcase the contributions and inventions of the Black community? And then the second question, which is really different, but I think is also really important and also not theoretical, is how do we get kids to have the skills that they need to be in STEM, especially around the importance of the technical skills, the, really understanding mathematics. How do we start really talking about getting that skill set to younger people so that we can have inventors and more diversity in STEM?
So I can start off. What I think about promoting the achievements and experiences of Black folks, I think operates in two planes. Like a lot of times when people are interested in these type of issues, racial equity and so on, it's usually from the lens of their work, but not their lives, their personal lives. And so I think one way is really in your home, gathering Black literature and books, gathering Black materials and Black media to educate not only yourself, but your spouse, your family members, grandparents, grandma, granddad, uncles, nephews, cousins, sisters, brother. Like it has to be, I think, a personal thing that you are taking this on to, like, in my personal realm, those who I have influence over, I'm trying to amplify, not educate, not force them to whatever, but just say, like, this is wonderful, this is beautiful, this is genius, right? Check this out, and spread in that way, in addition to whatever your profession is, intentionally seeking out opportunities, right? Because sometimes those things, they don't just pop up. It's not inevitable that you'll get opportunities. So you have to be creative in the way that you find, moments where you can highlight or build upon, right? If you're working in an innovative space, then bring into a ideation meeting what some Black person has done and say, what can we learn from this? How can we dissect this? How can we learn from this and scrutinize what took place so that we can learn from it, right? So I think it's a personal and professional type of thing. In terms of helping students getting the skills they need, again, that's a more of an educational shift where part of it is shifting dispositions around why students don't have what they need. A lot of times it's the conversation around what the problem is the student, and there's a deficit orientation around what this student doesn't have this, whatever. And I think reframing that to say, well, what do they have that we can work with, and what do we need to shift as the educators or the institutions who are educating certain folks? What are we missing about what they already possess that can be used as a foundation to help them gather the skills that we want them to have? If we're trying to teach them math and students are interested, well, what are they interested in, and what's the math in that? What are the ways that science shows up in their home, in the areas of intrinsic motivation that these young people are telling us that show up for them? And I think that shouldn't be done just to kind of attract and woo and then trick, like, all right, now let's do it the way I want, but rather to cause ourselves to move outside to their realms to diversify, and again, how we understand the world.
And can you talk a little bit about who's responsible for education? Because, in our society, we put a lot of onus on the teachers, but there are a whole lot of other actors, especially in the African-American community, that, we should start giving credit and skill sets to as well.
I think education, I think W.B. Du Bois said, education is the training of life. Like everything, that every experience that someone has, that's education. And we're talking about schooling in particular, then we have named people, and then you have, your parents are your first educators type of thing. But if we're talking about learning, I think as students navigate life, the folks in the community, the restaurant owners, corner store owners, the postal workers, postal carriers, like all those folks tell us something about our existence. But I think that the people who are in place, particularly policymakers, need to be more accountable for allowing value for communal knowledge. I don't know if that necessarily gets at what you was looking for, but
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Amy, did you want to add to the last question?
Um, I think that,
But
yeah, I guess I'll jump back for just a second to the idea of the value and the possibilities of the kind of sharing the lives and attainments of inventors of color, innovators of color, and I think that you know, I've always been I was trained as a historian of technology at a moment when that field was sort of pushing back the notion that the great inventor, you know, explained societal change. The great inventor pushed civilization forward, even worse, right? And of course, those people were always white, and they were usually men, and they were all Euro-American, right? And so, the question of what to do with minoritized folks with that kind of attainment is a complicated question. And I've had this idea that of kind of trying to avoid the notion of, it's the missing, let's find the missing people. Because the problem is that it doesn't then expose the structures that have excluded them. It doesn't expose the definitions of achievement or attainment. And it certainly doesn't draw our attention to folks who never, you know, never formulated a patent or never scaled up their invention, right? So I've sort of come to feel like that's also, that's not the answer either. It's I guess I'm seeing the stories of you know, past inventors and innovators of color as necessary but not sufficient to the understanding that larger historical picture that James spoke of. And I guess what I would like to add to those histories is the history of the history. How do certain people end up in the historical record? Who controls the historical record and who's not there? And I think partly of work that's done by folks like Ron Eglash and Michael Latchney and other folks, and there's so many interesting folks working on indigenous knowledge and again, race positive ideas of invention, that if we could get our museums and our textbook writers and our encyclopedia writers to kind of frame with a reflection on what has made people visible and visible, what brings people into the eligibility for celebration. I think that adds layers and layers to what we'll all learn by looking at past experience. In a way, it's a bit like what James said, that we tend to look at what people do and not their lives. And the lives of many, you know, white band holders have involved, you know, lives of security and affluence and education. We should acknowledge that, and we should acknowledge where non-patent holders may have been marginalized. So I guess I love the idea of having past actors and individuals put into context, and that context includes our own understanding of what has value and who has value. I think that could point us to some really big, important patterns.
yeah.
so as I look at the, go ahead, James.
Well, I was looking at some comments too, and I think Amy and I, we, you know, haven't known each other a super long time, but we get in these conversations and like just kind of geek out. And so I think that we exist in the higher education space, and traditionally I've seen this like more theoretical and not practical. But I think it's kind of unfortunate, and I think that's not we shouldn't dichotomize those things that way, but like look at it as like we have to understand what we're thinking about, what ideas are informing, what practices, what practical actions we are taking, right? And so I think when we look at a lot of issues, part of it, going back to one of your earlier questions, Yolanda, around why a lot of there's been a lot of money poured into things and a lot of initiatives created, why they've been ineffective is because there hasn't been enough thinking around theorizing around why you're doing what you're doing and what type of ideas or principles should be valued. I think folks are so focused on the impact that they want to have and not doing enough hard thinking and you know, really digging in on how do we get there given this broken context that we exist in, right? Because if you already have a dysfunctional reality that is so strong and so messy, you really have to spend a significant amount of time unpacking that before you can get at like, what should I do? And sometimes you just have to kind of wait and to make sure that your action, even if it seems insignificant, doesn't have a broad impact, that it's the right action to take. I think we need to focus more so on right actions rather than like significantly impactful and large effect, largely scaled up actions.
So I think that the STEM issue and getting more diversity in STEM has, I'm going to say, suffered from the same kind of thing that, let's say food medicine has suffered from. So, you read one day that coffee is bad for you, you read the next day it's great for you. So we've, in policy work, I think we've had that same issue of when new research comes out, people get rid of the program that they had before, and they start all over with something new based on research. But, like Amy mentioned the NASA program. So where's that program now? Because, then people say, okay, something new's come out, let's try something new. So can you talk a little bit about, the practicality of how we turn research into policy making and programs, and, how we evaluate whether what we're doing is working or not working?
So I can respond real quickly on that NASA thing, which I've been trying to follow up on, and there are ways that aspects of that kind of programming, that kind of really agile and reflective granting structure have survived, but the entire culture of grant giving has changed as well. And since the late 1990s, I mean, we're more decades out from, our overt majority commitment to civil rights, and there's been huge legal backlash and cultural backlash against affirmative action. So now a lot of programs that would have kind of had, I think, been more acceptable to, I don't know, to congressional appropriations, or even just NSF, have backed off from that. And I'm trying to track them, but I think that the rise of things like No Child Left Behind, and even the national science standards for K-12, I think those have been places that have sort of, in their way, as much as they tout achievement and attainment and inclusion and diversity, they shut down that notion of flexibility. And I think higher ed, I mean, many STEM focused universities, and all universities, they survive on their rankings, and their rankings have to do with SAT scores and their research dollars. And so it's a really reinforcing conservative system, I'm afraid. And as a historian, I painted against a backdrop of conservative retrenchment since the 90s. I had another point there before I went off on my historical rant. And I think that one of the things we can sort of do is imagine that perspective. Well, first of all, I think this kind of week where we have so many perspectives and so many kind of multiple, ways of framing the situation. I won't say the problem, I'll say the circumstances. And honestly, to be under the imprimatur of Lemelson, which is such a credible actor and such a visible platform, right? I think you have to have this stuff. You have to have stuff where these very hard questions are circulating without the pressure of fundable research outcomes, right? If we don't have these challenges, the policy will never change. So I hope that supports. I'll stop there because I'm going to go off on a whole other direction. Go ahead, James.
I think that the discord between the research and practice communities need to be disrupted. Like, the discord needs to be disrupted, and there needs to be a reconciliation between those two communities, where researchers are not just looking for innovation and what's new, but actually designing and researching to address the practical needs of folks who are practitioners and on the ground, and vice versa. Folks who are dealing with fires, dealing with historical inequities, they are intentionally making time to say, okay, I know we're in this mess right now, but where can we imagine or design for it from 5 years from now or 10 years from now? So I think there has to be this tense, conflict-inducing, difficult, hard, long relationship building between those two sectors, because currently I've only been in the academy just a year or so, well, I guess as a professor, but in terms of my studying degrees, I've been there, and it's like, it really forces me. I want to be community centric, but I have to work so hard to actually do what I believe is best, or not even what I believe is best, what community practitioners tell me is best for them, right? In terms of time, pursuing tenure and the demands on me, in terms of what's valuable. The currency of the academy is journal publications, not necessarily innovative creations that shift this particular community. And so I think that those stakeholders, if you will, in those two different type of communities have to be so vigorously committed that they forge an innovative and inventive type of relationship that's reciprocal.
Okay, so we are almost out of time, and we've had some incredible audience questions, and I've tried to ask them a lot of times in a little bit of a shorter form than people have asked. But is there anything in the last couple minutes that either one of you want to add that you feel like you haven't gotten a question about, or just a philosophy of yours that you think is really important to get out around invention and STEM diversity?
Well, I just say this kind of line I just thought of. Everyone can't create Black thought, but everyone can celebrate Black thought. And I think, like, for me, that's what I think we need to see more of, is an intentional celebration and recognition. Like, whatever that means for you to spend the time looking, searching, and being specific. I mean, that's not to denounce any other group or undermine any other group, but it's more so to have a particularity and specificity around what is about Blackness and the culture of Black people and the thought and experiences of Black people that provide a unique contribution to our world that we all can benefit from, right? And I think we need more of that, because currently it's the opposite. There's constant anti-Blackness, and I would like to see that dissipate.
Yeah, thank you, James. That was really eloquently put. And I would just add that I think that as I listen to my Black students in STEM fields and without, they are so hungry for the voices and experiences of Black faculty in the humanities, in STEM. And I think if we cannot, as a nation, find ways, first of all, to secure tenure and get out of this awful labor situation that is eroding our universities, but I think we have got to find a way to seriously change the demographics of our professoriate. It's got to change across STEM, social sciences, and humanities, or a lot of what we're saying will never engage our students, and it shouldn't, the way it's being offered. So.
Well, thank you very much to both Amy and James. It's been really exciting and fun to have this conversation with you. I also, of course, want to again thank the Smithsonian Lemelson Center for making this all happen and giving us the opportunity to put these viewpoints out in front of the hundreds of people that have logged in. Again, want to thank the Lemelson Foundation for supporting this series. And I want to remind you that it's going on all this week. It starts at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Tomorrow, there's a discussion about Black inventors and innovators at work, with Tyrone Grandinson and Tahira Reed Smith, being moderated by Monica Smith. So I hope that you will all join us again tomorrow. And thank you very, very much for your time, audience. And thank you so much for your questions. I got to as many of them as I could.
Thank you, Yolanda, for just amazing, smooth steering and wrangling and brilliant questions. Thank you so much. And
thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
And thank you, James.
Yeah,
thank you, James.
Nice to see you or hear from you, Annette Benson. Shout out real quick. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.